without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Sean Dinneen, who is chairing our next session, which is focusing on the impact of the crisis and how we actually do research. And Sean is the program lead for the newly launched National PPI Network, which aims to increase the capacity for high quality public and patient involvement in health and social care research in Ireland. He's also an academic endocrinologist and is national lead for the diabetes clinical care program of the HSE, the Irish HSE. And if you look at the full agenda, you'll see Professor Dinneen has a very impressive bio. He studied in the US and through the Mayo Clinic, and in Canada via McMaster University, and in Addenbrooke's in Cambridge. So very impressive CV, Sean. And I know you were the head of the School of Medicine before I was in NUIG for a short period, from 2013 to 2016. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Dinneen.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks to Avril and the organisers for inviting me to chair this second session. I'm a diabetes clinician, and you will have noticed, although the main focus of the first panel was on the COVID crisis, but it is actually plural crises in the agenda. And as a clinician involved in research, we of course have had the dual crises of COVID and the HSE cyber attack. So my goal in this second session is to try and keep it engaged. I think it's fair to say that looking at the list of attendees and the comments on the chat, if you're here, you're involved in research, and I suspect strongly you're passionate about delivering on research in Ireland, and I think that's certainly something that connects us all. We have people on this second panel who are involved in delivering research, or who have perspectives that we can learn from, who have perhaps been involved in the Irish health system and organizing things in the Irish health system in the past, but also people who are passionate about delivering on high quality research. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sheuli Porkess, who's the first speaker on this second panel. Sheuli, thank you for joining us. Sheuli is Vice President-elect of the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine and Director of Actaros Consultancy, I hope I said that correctly, and is an experienced pharmaceutical physician with expertise in medicines development, medical affairs and research policy within the UK and internationally. One of Sheuli's former roles was as Director of Research, Medical and Innovation at the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, and she led on policy work in that role on PPI, public and patient involvement. So Sheuli, we're looking forward very much to your contribution. And I saw a comment on the chat. What are the new crisis prompted practices that should be retained? And I might suggest to all three panelists that we maybe keep that in the back of our minds as something. It captures it very well, I think. Sheuli, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to join you and delighted to speak on behalf of the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, which is a professional body for doctors like myself working in research, development and regulation of new medicines and vaccines. And FPM's mission is to advance the science and practice of pharmaceutical medicine for the benefit of the public. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we've done as FPM, our insights on clinical trials resilience, and then some thoughts on patient and public involvement, and stick to time as well, you'll be pleased. So, as you know, it's been said, it's unprecedented times and hard times, but echoing what Lisa said earlier, I never thought I'd see a time where clinical research was the first item regularly on the news, and people are interested in what we do. And as our members, as the faculty members work on medicines and vaccines, we as the faculty had to work in a variety of different ways, at pace and with members, policymakers and with the public, and we continue to do so. And what does that look like? That looks like explaining with events, blogs, comments in the media, what was happening medically, and as that unfolds with COVID, the development of new vaccines and medicines and what that involves, offering insights on booster doses, access, distribution, preparedness for public health emergencies, as well as encouraging participation and engagement and involvement in trials and then vaccine uptake. We also kept members up to date on what it meant for them in the workplace and what it means to them. And also because our members are doctors, helping them register to become vaccinators, because lots of them wanted to go back and do that. And this continues. So we had our annual symposium last week, and we discussed the fact that we're at a critical time in pharmaceutical medicine. You know, what else do we need to do as a specialty to prevent and treat COVID? What do we need to do to help address the impact of the pandemic on people's health across all the other conditions? And also how to innovate to be resilient to new challenges, whether that's this pandemic, future pandemics, climate change, or something else. So thinking about trials in particular, I'd like to talk you through the FPM work on understanding the impact of the pandemic on trials and how we might mitigate this in the future. So how do we build that resilience? Going back to 18 months ago in the UK, is the parallel to what was described earlier, resources were diverted away from non-COVID trials. NHS staff who usually supported research moved to the front line. And the research that was happening was refocused on the hunt for therapies for COVID and then vaccines. And as Carol described really eloquently earlier, it was enormously challenging. And so in order to understand more on whether adaptations could or should be made permanent, the FPM conducted a clinical trials resilience survey last year. And these results have been shared with the UK Joint Government's Recovery, Resilience and Growth Clinical Research Programme Board. And there were 4 key sort of main learnings. So one is risk planning for pandemics needs to be reviewed and updated for all activities related to clinical trials and pharmaceutical medicine. For example, sponsors need to discuss with regulators future flexibility around all research procedures. And we need development and adoption of tools that could support remote use, such as e-consent and remote monitoring, absolutely reflecting the need for the things that Carol was talking about earlier. Second thing the survey showed was we need to do more to embed resilience into the healthcare system. COVID-19 was and continues to be a reminder that infection is the commonest respiratory disease and killer. So there must be more of a focus of attention and funding on infection to allow us to be better prepared for the inevitable emergence of new pathogens or resistant pathogens, as was picked up earlier. Thirdly, small companies with innovative products and ideas shouldn't be overlooked, and they need to be engaged and incentivized to participate in collaborations. And then the fourth big learning was the importance of expertise in pharmaceutical medicine and medicines development in public sector decision making was emphasised. You know, we need people, policymakers, to be able to draw on their expertise to inform a consolidated shift to global health security programming. And we were on that last point, we were really delighted that key public figures, for example, Dr. June Rain, Chief Exec of the MHRA, and Professor Jonathan Van Tam, Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England, both spoke passionately about this need for cross-sector collaboration and skills and knowledge transfer at our annual symposium last week. And since then, we've looked at diversity in trials, impact of COVID-19 on women's health and careers, picking up on Mairead's point, supported members with resilience, training on observational studies in COVID, and ensure ongoing engagement with stakeholders to work out how to support that needed shift to new ways of doing trials. And that has to include equitable patient and public involvement in clinical trials. I mentioned FPM's mission at the start, and the foundation of mission is the public, which means we need to work out how best to work together and involve them. And I've worked on patient and public engagement for a number of years now within various roles. And there's a lot of work on co-developing systems to involve patients and public in the design of clinical research, so that research will be more relevant and more likely to be acceptable. And that ranges from looking at this meme of the public aren't experts in clinical trials, they won't understand, through to practical things about contracts. And a couple of resources that to flag are, the toolbox that's come from Paradigm, which was an EU IMI project, on how to plan engagement, conduct it and report it. and you, Patty, providing patients with information and training to help them meaningfully contribute, and a number of others. However, despite all of that, when COVID hit, patient involvement in designing studies dropped, as Peter said. And the Health Research Authority in England wrote that normally 80% of their applicants with research tell them that they either have or will involve patients and the public in their research in some way. But when they looked at a sample of the first 40 COVID applications that were eligible for that fast track review back in March, that had dropped just to 22%. And one of the issues was that researchers thought that public and patients couldn't be involved because it was the need for expedited timelines. But actually that wasn't the case. People were happy to involve, but it wasn't happening. So we need to continue to work together on this until it just is the way things are done and isn't optional. One of the things we're doing at FPM is that our new curriculum for doctors training in pharmaceutical medicine to become specialists in pharmaceutical medicine includes the need for trainees to show that they understand how to undertake patient engagement activities. So we're really looking to see what we can do to develop this further. So in conclusion, we've learned that communication, collaboration and agility in a crisis is key in pharmaceutical medicine, as with any other sector. I think the crisis has accelerated part of the evolution of clinical trials, such as remote monitoring, but it's also exposed weaknesses, such as the fact that PPI wasn't as embedded as we'd hoped. And events like today are so important to work out where we want to go to next collectively. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sheuli. Sheuli, can I ask if you think that the public's view of pharmaceutical medicine, or the pharmaceutical industry in particular, I guess R&D, has changed as a result of, I did not know about coronavirus on the 1st of January 2020, and on the day before New Year's Eve, I was vaccinated against the virus. It's just a phenomenal story. And I know it's more than the pharmaceutical industry that created that opportunity. But do you think people's attitudes towards big pharma has changed as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, we've so ABPI, the UK Trade Association, has done some work to look at public attitudes, and they continue to track it, and that's available on their website. And that shows that there has been a shift in public attitudes, but it's really, my reading of it is really based on people understanding more about medicine's development and what it involves, and all the safeguards that are in place. And I think the COVID example is really interesting because you've got on the one hand pharma delivering what people need with the vaccine and now therapeutics coming through, but then on the other hand people quite understandably saying, hang on, you've been telling us it takes years to do stuff, how come you've just done it in a year? And that's where you're then getting into, well, actually it wasn't from scratch. There'd been lots of research going on. The mRNA vaccines were built on 10 years of prior research that had been ongoing. And also we did things in parallel at risk, as in at risk being you do things sequentially. And if it passed one stage, you'd then go on to the other. Instead, we'd say, okay, we'll do this. We'll also start looking at manufacturing, but we know the medicine may not meet the right standards, and then we've lost all that time with the manufacturing. So explaining that's super important in order for people to get the trust and the understanding. And as I say, as a faculty, we've been so busy with people coming to us saying, okay, right, this is bit of news has just hit, explain what that means, how does this work? Which is great that we can provide those insights to help people understand.
Thanks very much, Sheuli. And I'll come back to the panel as a panel on some of those questions around, what crisis prompted practices should we try to retain. I'm going to move on to our next panel speaker, Richard Corbridge. Richard, you're very welcome back to Ireland.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, Richard is a globally recognized expert in digital technology and its application to healthcare, and has many years of experience working as Chief Information Officer in sort of diverse organizations. Currently, Richard is the first Director of Innovation at Boots UK, with the remit to deliver a transformed, high street pharmacy and healthcare, experience for customers. Earlier in his career, Richard was CIO of the HSE, and led, a lot of initiatives that are having impact in our health service in Ireland, and was named #1 CIO from the UK in 2017. So Richard is going to speak again. The theme is the impact of the crisis on how we do research, and I guess we'll bring that sort of digital health perspective. Richard, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sean. And it's been a great panel, and thanks to everybody who's spoken so far. It's been really great to hear such wide views of where we go and what we do. Before I came to Ireland as CIO of the health service there, I was CIO of the National Institute for Health Research. So clinical research has always been a big part of my view of what digital technology can do in healthcare. And even now, working in Boots, a big focus of the next period of time for Boots is how do we help healthcare systems in Ireland and in the UK to truly become more capable of delivering healthcare and wellness to patients. But I think the two crises, as we've been talking about, and the impacts they've had on my areas of focus would be almost straight away the speed of technology change that's being created has been fascinating. So the fact that in both in Ireland and in the UK, a sudden impetus to not invest money, but invest time and effort in delivering healthcare through digital platforms wasn't an option anymore. It became the reality and a must do. So moving so many GP appointments, for example, online to be done virtually or through capabilities other than queuing up, waiting for appointments and going to see somebody became the norm. A norm that oddly is winding back quite quickly, even though patients ranging from children through, my mum, she's 78 years old, she lives on the Scottish border. She would never have ever have done a Skype call to us as a family, particularly before the pandemic, and definitely wouldn't have spoken to her consultant in Newcastle. Now she's getting back in her car once a month to drive from the Scottish borders to Newcastle to talk to a consultant about her Parkinson's. The mind boggles that we've done something so quickly and it's been adopted and become a practice, back to your other comment earlier, Sean, that people were happy enough with. I'm not saying that people were enthused by, but people were happy enough with and could see the convenience and could see the speed and change the way clinicians could deliver care. And yet, for whatever reason, and there are many, I'm sure, we seem to be winding that back, which I feel is a shame, because the acceptance of technology in healthcare and in clinical research by patients and the ability to use that technology by clinical researchers and healthcare agents has changed. I think what has then moved forward, though, is a dawning that's been needed in Ireland and needed in the UK for a long time, that technology that works in healthcare has to be invested in. IT is expensive, painfully expensive in healthcare, and that painful expense is down to the lack of consistent investment. So big bungs that happen in the UK, in the 2002, 2003, 12 billion pounds was spent on a big IT program, huge amounts of money, but then nothing was spent subsequently until this last 12 months. So people wonder, why is IT so expensive? Well, you have to sweat the asset, and I accept that, but to sweat it to the point where it stops working is actually then expensive to replace. And I think that's another thing that's come out of both the cyber attack in Ireland and the response to COVID has been that a constant higher investment in technology to support healthcare and the delivery of clinical trials is entirely necessary and perhaps becoming more accepted. I wasn't in Ireland during the cyber attack, but spoke to many, many friends and old colleagues at the time. And the general feeling was that the lack of investment had to be one of the contributors to the cyber attack being so pervasive in how it was able to take hold of so many systems. The fact that systems were protected to the degree they could be, but could be is really important in there. So one of the things that we saw with WannaCry when I was in Ireland was that a real clamour to say, why hasn't the health service kept its security and patching and capability to protect its systems up to date? And at the time, it was a fair comment to make, except when you look at the cost of doing that. So it's not as easy as simply rolling out the antivirus and patching to everybody's laptop and machine and phone across the health service. What about the machine that's connected to the scanner, the blood scanner, the X-ray machine, etc.? And the X-ray machine's €1 million. But suddenly the laptop that's connected to it that does the reading is out of date. But to update the laptop, you've got to update the X-ray machine. So suddenly you end up with this dichotomy of ways of working, of inability to keep and protect systems because that constant investment isn't there in how that works. And I think when you then look at how clinical research needs data to change, transform, to move as quickly as the whole world did against COVID, to create the vaccines, to create our response, you then begin to understand where the thought practices need to change and be different so that we constantly do that. I think, you look at how quickly Ireland was able to stand up its track and trace solution, how cheaply it was able to do that track and trace solution compared to those guys over here who made a complete dog's dinner of it, if we're absolutely honest, for a little while there. You start to realize that the skill set in the health service in Ireland is phenomenal. They led the world to create a solution, and many, many other countries copied what Ireland did. And yet then when it came to the cyber security issues and the threat, and then the issues that landed off the back of that, that showed it wasn't a skill set. It wasn't even a view of the world. It was old technology, a lack of investment over a period of time that then sort of contributed collectively to it being a target that was there. It is horrific, isn't it? That there are bad actors out there that wanted to go after health services. We've seen it with WannaCry. You in Ireland have now seen it in probably the world's worst real impact at a country level of something like that happening. But sadly, it's not if anymore, it's when. And that is still there. And I think looking at my own organization now and looking at the NIHR as a previous organization as a comparator, where organizations in healthcare are big targets because we have IP, we have information that is actually worth more to bad actors, to other states, to criminals than almost any other type of data. If you ask a patient whether they would be more worried about their financial data in the public domain or their healthcare data, almost always they'll say healthcare data. And therefore we need to spend the same amount of effort and money and time that the financial institutes of the world have done in protecting their data to get there. If you think as well about another practice, which I think is really useful from a technology point of view, and that's the recruitment side. I think we can do recruitment through technology for clinical trials way more easily than we can do it in any other way. And I think trying to find global standards that enable us to do that is a really big solution to where we go and will help us stop that idea of us going back. The idea of us going back to old practices, back to paper, back to not having an electronic health record, not storing information about people so it can be shared with clinicians of all different practices with the right consent, is something we have to be really mindful of. We have to build security into all solutions from the beginning and build it into practices as well. Most cyber threats that happen, that become real, are actually down to people doing something that was perhaps a little silly, perhaps something they shouldn't have done. And we have to consider that people change, that transformation that happens as well from a technology point of view. I guess from a summary point of view, those practices that have changed around how we do things quickly, how the technology parts of healthcare, whether it's clinical research, community pharmacy in my part, have now altered so that they can move so much more quickly and have that agility, that innovation mindset from the beginning has become a really big part for me. And I think we can do that. I really do.
Thanks very much, Richard. And yeah, I guess the opportunities for us to think differently about healthcare delivery and research in this whole area is something that maybe we are still mulling over. Again, I'm going to ask you as a panel, but that great question of, you know, what should be retained. You've suggested global standards for electronic recruitment. Of participants in clinical research studies. What does that look like? Are you aware of that happening anywhere?
Data standards, yes. So people starting to create and then share how data should be collected. I think we've seen in the NHS a real move towards how consent is captured, how it's explained and how it's done as well. So some amazing stuff that's come out of the Great North Care Record. So out of Newcastle, a chap called Professor Joe McDonald has really taught the NHS how to ask for consent, how to store consent, and how to share the fact that consent has been given for trials. So I think standards and capability is starting to happen, and maybe in the best way, actually. It's happening in pockets. It's on us as digital leaders, as healthcare leaders, as clinical researchers to do, though, is start to join those pockets up on a national stage and allow people to make choices around them. There isn't a single global national body that will define these standards. We, as people with responsibility for clinical research, need to step forward and offer those standards so they become adopted by the system, would be my own view.
And a theme, Richard, I would suggest a theme that has been running through our discussions this morning is public and patient involvement. Is there a role, do you think, for public and patients to participate in shaping those standards? And if so, how would you envisage that happening?
Hugely, and that's, you know, the stuff I mentioned about Newcastle. That's why Newcastle was so successful. Is that Joe? He literally had the sort of public and patient involvement in defining what the language should be to seek consent. He sort of famously stands on stage and say the easiest way to get consent is to ask for consent, as opposed to tying ourselves up in knots, which is what the NHS has done on at least 2 occasions in the last decade. It hasn't spoken to public and patients. It hasn't spoken to clinicians. Lawyers and strategists have written consent documentation that has landed on the doormat of a member of the public who's just gone, I don't get it. And then 2 things happen. Either people rebel against it and say, over my dead body, am I going to be involved in clinical research? Or they just become ambivalent to it and never take part, and we end up ruining where we are. So I think PPI done well in creating consent in particular, and how data is stored and where data is stored, is huge. If we can get to a point, and technology allows us to do this, where you, the participant in the clinical trial, hold on to your data, you can see who's accessed it and seed that information out to others. I think that has to be something of a panacea that we aim for at a technology level.
Great. So it seems like seeking and obtaining consent under challenging circumstances is a nice segue into our next speaker. So thanks very much, Richard. I'm going to now introduce my colleague here in Galway, Dr. Bairbre McNicholas. Bairbre is a consultant, dual trained in intensive care and in nephrology at Galway University Hospitals, and a senior lecturer in medicine at NUI Galway. Bairbre has been involved in a number of COVID-related and perhaps ICU-related initiatives that have grown out of COVID, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from her in terms of working differently in the clinical research space, maybe working, collaboratively across, not just across countries, but across, not just across this country, but across countries. So, Bairbre, over to you, and thanks for participating this morning.
Well, I'm delighted, and it's actually been fascinating to listen to the different perspectives. And I probably have quite a different perspective from both Richard and Sheuli this morning, and it's very much at a patient level. So as Sean described, I'm an ICU consultant. And the patient population we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and prior to COVID are very sick. That's taken for granted, and they're often sick to the point that you can't get individual consent from them. They wouldn't be able to, have the facilities to do that, and you often get assent from family members. And one of the first trials I was involved with in the unit was TAME, which was an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest study. So this was an extremely time-sensitive study. You had to have the patients randomized within 240 minutes of their kind of recovering from their out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And that time frame and that urgency to get somebody into a study. And what we were doing was setting their ventilator to a higher or a lower carbon dioxide level. Now, this wasn't any pharmaceutical intervention. It was a mechanical ventilator intervention. So if you have a higher carbon dioxide, I don't know if you notice people with COPD, their veins are quite prominent. They wanted to try and take advantage of that to try and drive blood into the brain, to see if in somebody who has got their heart rhythm back, that if you could improve their cerebral perfusion by running a higher carbon dioxide. And again, randomizing that process of telling a patient that, look, we think this might work, but we're going to give you a half a chance you might get it and half a chance you won't, was the process by which we went about it. So the systems that we had to develop, the infrastructure that we had to have, communication with the emergency department, consultants, nurses, the ICU nurses, that we could identify somebody as soon as they come in, that we could go down there, get them into the study, then identify their family members, make sure that they understood that their family member was involved with the study. It was hugely important. Now, the study finished up recruitment, and it actually recruited really well despite COVID, and we'll probably find out in a year or two if it worked. And the fact that it was not a blinded study either, so we knew when somebody got the higher carbon dioxide and they didn't. We had situations where somebody came off the ventilator after a very long downtime, and they were talking to us, and we're like, oh God, this is amazing, and then you obviously are going to be very conflicted, which is another reason when we do trials, it's very important you blind. So I think that was one of the first studies I was involved with in the unit, and it told me, if you want to get studies done, unfortunately, it just takes an awful lot of people power. You really need to have engagement, both for the patient, all the practitioners that are involved with this. It also tells me that, when you have an idea of something that works, a clinical trial is absolutely important to see if it is actually something that will work for everybody. Just because I've seen a difference doesn't mean that it needs to be applied to everybody. It needs to be done rigorously and scientifically. And that brings me on to the study that I was involved with during COVID, which was awake proning. Now, I had experience of using this technique prior to COVID. We had a gentleman who had bad acute respiratory distress syndrome. He was extubated early and then just started crumpling. His oxygen levels were desaturating. He was getting into more distress. But he wasn't so distressed that, we said, God, why don't we just try him on his tummy? It's what we do when people are ventilated, when they're paralyzed. Why don't we just see if it'll work? And I actually hadn't read the literature too much on it because it just seemed like an obvious thing to do. And he very dramatically improved his oxygen. And it bought us time. He actually probably had developed another pneumonia on top of it. And it was very nice to see. And it's very satisfying as a doctor to see oxygen levels going up. It's one of these really nice things when somebody pinks up, when somebody gets more comfortable. So we did know that this worked, but we didn't know was if you improve your oxygen levels, does that actually translate into something meaningful, which is you go home better, you go home sooner, or you avoid mechanical ventilation. And we do know that if you don't go on a ventilator early enough and you leave somebody chugging down very large volumes of oxygen, you can really damage your lungs. And particularly with COVID, there was a lot of kind of opinion that, inflamed lungs shouldn't get very big and deep breaths that people could be doing. And then you could actually potentially make the situation worse by not ventilating them. So we here in Galway decided to start our own clinical trial. And we applied to the HRB for funding. And I think there was one really good advantage of that is because there was a very tight schedule. And I know Dr. Driscoll mentioned that, they were lenient. We were very busy, setting up the unit, doing all the things, learning how to put PPE on. And then in the middle of this, writing a protocol, writing ethics, getting, data protection impact assessment plans on the data that we'll be using, getting a randomization strategy. There's a huge amount of infrastructure that you need to get a study off the ground. Now, I was lucky; it was a non-pharmaceutical study, so it had about maybe a half of the usual amount of regulation. But one other thing that we did, which was we registered our trial on clinicaltrials.gov. So this is kind of a forum where you can register your study to do that you're doing, and you outline your plans for it. And because we did that, we were approached by another group in France who were doing pretty much the same study. And they previously published this meta-trial kind of idea of doing a study. So this is not where you do a centralized randomized control trial, which is where usually, you know, when we normally do clinical trials in any part of medicine, it's usually sponsored by one study center. They do all the protocols, they do the ethics, and it's very onerous. It takes a long time for all the different contracts to go back and forth. The plan we had was that each individual center would do their own study, but that we'd share our data as the study went on, and that we would publish together as a group. So we had to have a kind of gentleman's agreement that we would do this together. We couldn't afford to get lawyers involved because we knew it would slow us down. We didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. So we started this back in March 2020. And then there was a lull across the world as lockdowns went on. We were like, oh no, we won't be able to get our study done, you know, because it looked like things were stopping, and it had taken off in the US. So our colleagues in the US were recruiting loads of patients, and it got to a point they had 100 patients, and people were publishing in the New England on 50 patients, and they very could easily have just stopped, ditched us and gone and published, but it would have been a very weak study. It wouldn't have answered any questions, and it would have just been for the benefit of the authors. And they were really, really strong clinicians. They said, no, we're doing this together. And we kept recruiting to the point we got to 1,000 patients. And we were able to stop at 1,000 patients because we reached our interim analysis showing that there was a benefit to awake proning. It did prevent intubation and death. And we would not have been able to do that as quickly, and I will say efficiently. So because we did it as a meta trial, traditionally when you do a meta-analysis, my study will have got to completion or not, and I will publish it. Then the study in France would have got to completion and they would have published it. They would have each have to have it done 1,000 patients to got to that point if we did it simultaneously. The way we did it meant that we got to the answer much faster. We were actually able to stop our individual studies without having reached what we had planned to as an individual investigator. And it meant that so many patients weren't exposed to a procedure that we now know to be effective. And we were able to get it out into the medical community as an effective technique and an effective treatment. So I think it was definitely one of the advantages of having COVID was that, there was no meeting for conferences to decide this is what we're going to do. Everything was done on Zoom. It was done with sets of investigators that we hadn't met before, but based on their reputation and based on, everybody having agreed protocols, agreed ethics, a data sharing agreement that I wrote and that we kind of shared along with the groups, and then having a Google Drive, which was where we had to have our anonymized data, and then we had to have methodologies for data sets to be transferred. Like, actually, it wasn't Google, but it was our recruitment logs were on a Google Drive. So every time you recruited a patient, you put a number, you put not the patient number, obviously, but that was your site recruiting another patient. So it really showed that, the communication both within the hospital to allow studies to go on at an individual kind of hospital basis to internationally. Our study included Mexico, USA, Canada, France, and Spain. To have that concerted effort in response to COVID and to provide an answer to a clinical problem was something that I think was really, really useful. It gave a voice to investigators, which kind of brings me on to what the cyber attack was. The cyber attack almost silenced doctors. It was like the opposite happened. It was like you couldn't complain because you couldn't get on email to even complain. And, the patients who didn't get their treatment didn't get a voice. Everything that happened was removed. It was like your hands were cut off. And the people who died, and people had to have died, their voices weren't heard. And it's still something that I think angers me. It was almost like a terrorist attack on our healthcare system. And I think that really wasn't communicated. It didn't affect the Dublin hospitals as much as it did in the west of Ireland, but it was a really, really bad thing. People in the middle of their cancer treatments didn't know what cancer treatments they were getting. And I don't think we've emphasized the badness that this was. And I can't say anymore, it makes me very cross. But so I think the bottom line I'll say is that research can be done, and it can be done really well with infrastructure, with data, with people wanting to work together. And then cyber attacks, are bad. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bairbre. I can feel the pain and feel the passion actually in your, I mean, I think it's a remarkable story, what you've told. And I think it's a story of positivity and of pulling together and of, you know, thinking outside of the box, reaching out, you know, all those positive things in your proning in ICU trial. But then also, and it has to be said, as you just did very passionately, that the cyber attack was worse than COVID for practicing, you know, for trying to practice medicine. And it is that sort of dependence that we have on digital, which is wonderful when you can see, you know, Richard's mom getting care, you know, across the Zoom or the Skype. But at the same time, it just, when the plug is pulled on it, it really does disrupt everything, not just research, but everything. So thank you for those contributions. And I see that the chat has been busy, which is great. I do feel a sense of trying to manage a number of different inputs at the same time and processing them. So thanks to Avril for her help with that. I guess, you know, coming back to that original question at the end of session 1, in 5 or 10 years, if each of you are reflecting on this, you know, this past 2 years and the lessons that we have learned, I'll go maybe to Sheuli, Richard, and then Bairbre. What would you like to think, if there was one thing that you were to, you know, try to preserve from the awful experiences that we've had as a health system and as a healthcare research system, what would it be, Sheuli?
I'd like to see trials being moved to where the patient is, irrespective of their geography, demographic, or who their clinician is, that actually they can access them. And that would then depend on robust technology, digital data skills. And I'm going to squeeze the second one. The other one would be public involvement being taken beyond trials, but actually overall with policy and healthcare and research policy. So thank you.
And there are people on the call who are involved in running our clinical research facilities. So what, with your first point, what happens to CRFs if everything is done remotely?
Well, I don't think it's about not having CRFs. It's about CRFs refocusing to say, how can we support a trial being delivered to patients remotely? Because you still need to deliver the trial somehow, whether that's choosing the right bit of technology, making sure the data's working, making sure that patients can talk through a consent when they need to, or the trial is, you're still going to need people who are running the trial. It's just separating the geographical location from being able to get involved in the trial. Yeah,
thank you. Richard?
Under the sort of banner of ways of working, I'd call out 3 things. So the agility of delivering technology into healthcare was just astounding during the pandemic and has already started to slow back down again, which is sad. I think the closeness that clinicians got to technology was huge as well. So bringing the people that really needed to be part of it, the patients and clinicians, into it so they could really step forward and be in that whole conversation as it moved forward. So if we change the agility, we keep the clinicians there, but also the sharing. So I think the phenomenal work that Ireland did around its track and trace app, going open source and then sharing that with others so they could leapfrog and keep going, was amazing, and not something that in the past we would have seen easily done. So under those ways of working banner, those 3 things.
Yeah, thank you. Bairbre, your view, you're looking back on COVID, what would you like to see us preserve?
I think the forefront that research has been given and that it's never had before. So I think that every patient going into hospital, it should be, and what research study are you going to be in? And I think that just needs to be part of our clinical care. I think as a clinician, I practice ICU medicine, but I'm also very much, what clinical trial are you going in? And every nurse in our unit has been like that. And I think if we can keep that going, I think we'll be doing really well.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Just, I suppose, a couple of thoughts that have come to me. These fast changes that are occurring in our research processes, is there any concern that they would undermine the credibility of the research? Is that a fair question?
I'm happy to
Please, Sheuli.
Yeah, so I think this is where the collaboration with regulators is absolutely key. So from a medicines development perspective, and we saw some brilliant work across regulators where they very quickly got together and said, okay, what does this mean? You know, what are we looking for with vaccines, for example, in order to say you've done your COVID vaccine studies, what does that look like? And I think that having that ongoing collaboration across the regulatory framework is key, and incorporating the new things that Richard talked about. You know, you need not just to look at our current regulations, but have that foresight for what's coming along.
Yeah, and maybe, Sheuli, you may also be the best person to answer a specific question in the chat. Is around the experiences of recruiting children and adolescents to research studies. Do you have, through your faculty of pharmaceutical medicine, any experience of how people have had, I presume, to adapt to that, or are there specific lessons that we can learn from pediatrics?
Yeah, so we do have a group looking at pediatrics. One of the things, I guess, from my experience of talking to people was the emphasis that when you're talking to young people and children, it's not just them, it's their families, it's their carers. It's so, you know, early on in the pandemic, talking to people doing trials, saying, yeah, great, we can get the kids in, but if their parents can't be in with them because they have to self-isolate or whatever it, you know, the setup was, actually we're not going to get the children into the trials, and really sort of emphasizing the need to think about the whole family or social situation. But absolutely, I mean, it's something we need to keep working on.
Thank Sheuli, to thank Richard, and to thank Bairbre for your thoughts and for joining us this morning to reflect on this whole situation that we're in. Thank you very much.